The air on Bougainville was a living thing. It was not merely humid, it was a thick, breathing presence that coated the lungs and clung to the skin like a second layer of flesh. Sergeant Frank Miller felt it as a constant, grinding weight, a perpetual reminder of the suffocating world he inhabited. His platoon, a small, weary collection of men from the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, had been on this forgotten island for weeks, trading the slow, miserable grind of jungle patrols for brief, miserable respites in equally miserable foxholes. The enemy wasn't just the Japanese. It was the jungle itself. It was the razor-sharp fronds of the pandanus trees that sliced at exposed skin, the clouds of malarial mosquitoes that hummed an endless, irritating chorus, the rain that fell with the weight of a hammer and turned the earth into a soupy, clinging mud. Frank, a man whose face had been carved into a permanent expression of grim determination, wiped the sweat from his brow. His helmet felt like an oven on his head. He watched his men, each one a different shade of exhaustion and frayed nerves. There was Private Johnson, a kid from Kansas who still looked like he belonged on a high school football field, his youthful bravado slowly being eroded by the constant unseen threat. There was Corporal Rodriguez, a quiet, wiry man from New Mexico whose rifle seemed to be an extension of his own body and whose eyes never stopped scanning the green labyrinth around them. And then there was Private Davis, a big, broad-shouldered man with a strangely out-of-place sense of humor, who clutched a Winchester Model 1912 pump-action shotgun as if it were a family heirloom. The shotgun was an anomaly in the platoon. While most Marines carried the M1 Garand or the M1 carbine, Davis had insisted on his scattergun, a relic of trench warfare from a war gone by. It was a tool built for close-quarters mayhem, not the precision of long-range jungle combat. Other men had razzed him about it, joking about hunting quail in the jungle. But Davis was a man who lived by a simple philosophy. If a job was worth doing, it was worth doing with overwhelming force. In his mind, there was no better instrument for close-in work than a shotgun. Frank, a pragmatist to the core, saw the weapon's limitations but also its potential. The jungle was a world of ambush and sudden, brutal contact. In such a place, a weapon that could throw a wide pattern of lead was not a disadvantage. It was a terrifying secret. They were a few miles inland, near a place the maps called the Pocket, a Japanese stronghold carved into the volcanic rock and reinforced with an intricate network of bunkers and pillboxes. Intelligence reports, whispered down the line from command, spoke of a Japanese assault force gathering there, a human wave poised to break their lines and push them back into the sea. The air, already thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, now carried a new, far more sinister perfume, the creeping tendrils of dread. Every rustle in the undergrowth seemed to be a footstep, every snap of a twig a signal for attack. The jungle was a vast, verdant throat, and they were caught within its narrow, constricting passage. Frank crouched in the mud, his hand on the hilt of his K-bar knife. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of a coiled snake waiting to strike. He looked at Davis, who was meticulously cleaning his shotgun, his fingers moving with a practiced, almost loving care over the steel and wood. The low, metallic click as he pumped the action was a stark, jarring sound in the oppressive stillness, a promise of violence. "Just tell me you got enough shells for that thing, Davis," Johnson whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Davis looked up, a faint smile on his lips. "Enough to make him wish they stayed in Tokyo, kid." His words, meant to be a joke, hung in the air like a pall. They all knew the odds. The Japanese were fanatical fighters, masters of camouflage and sudden, brutal surprise. They would come at them with bayonets fixed, screaming their banzai charges, a terrifying spectacle of a foe that seemed to have no regard for their own lives. In the face of such a charge, a shotgun, with its limited range and slow reload time, seemed like an act of desperation. But Frank saw something else. He saw a weapon of last resort, a tool for a final desperate stand in a place where there was no room to run, no quarter to give, and no way out but through. The suspense was a physical ache in his bones, a constant thrumming in his temples. It was a war of nerves, and the jungle was winning. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the jungle took on a new, ghostly shade of gray and black. The chorus of insects intensified, a maddening symphony that drowned out the quiet anxieties of the men. Frank gave the order to dig in deeper, to prepare for a night of vigilant fear. Each man worked in a grim, methodical silence, their shovels scraping against the hard, unyielding earth. The scent of their labor mingled with the earthy smell of the jungle floor, a blend of sweat, soil, and dread. The night was their greatest enemy, a blanket that hid the monsters and magnified the fears. They were just men, tired, scared, and far from home, armed with the tools of war and a shotgun. And they waited. The night brought no peace. It brought a deepening of the sensory assault. The air grew thicker with the sweet, cloying smell of decaying vegetation and the biting scent of mud. The insect's hum rose to a fever pitch, an orchestra of madness that burrowed into the soldiers' minds. Sergeant Frank Miller, huddled in his foxhole, felt the minutes stretch into hours, each one a small, agonizing eternity. Every shadow seemed to move. Every strange sound in the undergrowth seemed to be a human footfall. His nerves, already stretched to their limit, felt like piano wire, ready to snap with the slightest provocation. The enemy was a ghost. They rarely saw them, not in the light of day. They saw the results of their work, a perfectly camouflaged sniper's nest, a tripwire attached to a grenade, or the sudden, silent flash of a bayonet thrust from the shadows. This was not a war of grand battles on open fields. It was a war of attrition, of ambush, of psychological torment. It was a war that gnawed at a man's soul and left him a hollowed-out husk. Private Johnson, his youthful bravado a distant memory, was now a bundle of raw nerves. He gripped his M1 Garand so tightly his knuckles were white. He had seen too much, too fast. He had watched a good man step on a mine, his body atomized in a deafening flash. He had seen the silent, terrifying efficiency of a Japanese patrol, their faces painted in grim determination, their movements as fluid and silent as a jungle cat. The war had taken a toll on him, a toll measured not in wounds, but in the haunted look in his eyes. Frank leaned over to him, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "Easy, Johnson. Just watch your sector. We're dug in deep." "I can't see him, Sergeant," Johnson whispered back, his voice thick with fear. "That's the thing. You never see him until they're on top of you." It was the truth. The Japanese were masters of concealment. They lived and breathed the jungle, a part of its primeval, brutal ecosystem. They could melt into the background, becoming one with the foliage and the shadow, only to reappear in a sudden, shocking burst of violence. The American forces, with their heavy equipment and loud movements, were like blundering beasts in this delicate, deadly ballet. The shotgun, Davis's singular, strange weapon, took on a new significance in the darkness. It was a weapon of last resort, a close-range equalizer. They all knew its limitations, its inability to reach out and touch the enemy at a distance, but they also knew its brutal power. The fear was that the enemy would close that distance. The hope was that they would have a chance to use the shotgun before the bayonets arrived. Davis was a bulwark of calm in the midst of the rising tide of fear. He sat in his foxhole, a cigarette glowing faintly in the darkness, the soft click of his shotgun being reloaded a constant, comforting rhythm. He was not a man given to grand pronouncements or displays of bravado. His confidence was quiet, born of a certainty in his tools and a simple, unyielding resolve. "You know, my pa used to say a fella could solve a lot of problems with a good scattergun," he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. Said it was a conversational weapon. You ask a question, and it gives you a whole lot of answers at once. Frank allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Let's hope they're questions they're willing to answer, Davis." The night deepened. The air grew heavier, the silence more menacing. The jungle was a pressure cooker, and they were the meat inside, waiting to be cooked. They took turns on watch, their eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable darkness, their senses on high alert for any sign of the approaching storm. It was a hellish waiting game, a test of will and nerve against an unseen, unrelenting enemy. The war in the Pacific was a different kind of war. It was a war of heat, of disease, of the constant threat of a silent, sudden death. It was a war that stripped men down to their most basic fears and instincts. Suddenly, a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible snap of a twig. Frank's heart pounded against his ribs. He signaled to the men, a slow, deliberate movement of his hand. They froze, their breath held, their senses focused on the sound. The silence returned, more terrifying than before. It was a mind game, a test of patience. The Japanese were masters of it. They would creep. They would wait. They would use the very terror of the waiting to break a man's spirit before they ever even engaged him. Frank could feel the sweat beading on his skin, a cold, clammy film. The tension was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest. He saw Johnson's eyes wide with a quiet, panicked terror. He saw Rodriguez, his body taut and ready, his rifle aimed at a place that held only shadows. He saw Davis calm and steady, his hand on the pump of his shotgun. In that moment, the shotgun, with its promise of close quarters, brutal violence, seemed like the only sane thing in a world that had gone completely mad. The night was a canvas of fear, and the only color was the dark, brooding green of the jungle. The morning dawned not with the cheerful promise of a new day, but with a sullen, brooding gray. The light filtered through the thick canopy of leaves, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to writhe and coil with a sinister life of their own. A fine mist, a perpetual reminder of the night's damp embrace, hung in the air. The men of Frank's platoon were exhausted, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, their eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The night had been a testament to their endurance, but it had also been a testament to their terror. They had survived, but they had been changed. Frank received the new orders in a hushed, urgent radio transmission from command. The intelligence was confirmed. The Japanese were massing for a major assault on the pocket. A full regiment, perhaps more, was preparing to break through their lines and drive them back. Their small, exhausted platoon was a critical part of the line, a small dam in a coming flood. The word was passed down the line, a grim, unspoken understanding that today would be different. Today, the ghosts would have faces. The news was received with a grim, quiet resolve. There was no bravado, no war cries. There was only the quiet acceptance of their fate. They were Marines. This was their job. They had been trained for this moment, for this kind of final, desperate stand. They checked their weapons, cleaned them, and reloaded. The familiar, rhythmic sounds of preparation were a comfort, a small bit of normalcy in a world of chaos. Davis's shotgun, a gleaming, sinister thing in the half-light, was no longer an anomaly. It was now a symbol of their desperation, a desperate prayer for survival. The close quarters of the jungle meant that the engagement would be at close range. There would be no distant, clean rifle shots. This would be a fight with bayonets and fists and the cold, unyielding reality of a man killing another man up close. In this savage dance, the shotgun was a king. It could deliver an immense amount of lethal force in a single, brutal moment, shattering a man's body with a force that a rifle round could only dream of. It's a turning point. "Sergeant," Rodriguez said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. "They're not just trying to push us back. They're coming for us. To wipe us out." Frank nodded, his eyes scanning the jungle. "Then we give them a welcome they won't forget." He looked at Davis, a silent, knowing look passing between the two men. Davis's face was a mask of grim determination. He knew the burden he carried, the responsibility that came with his unusual weapon. He had a job to do, and it was a job that no one else was equipped to handle. The hours ticked by, each one filled with a mounting, excruciating tension. They heard them before they saw them, a low guttural murmur that rose and fell like a tide. The Japanese were chanting, their voices a chilling, primal sound that sent a shiver down the spines of the men. It was a psychological weapon, designed to intimidate and terrify, to break a man's will before the fight even began. But Frank's men had been through too much. They had stared into the heart of the jungle's madness, and they had not blinked. Then came the rustling, the unmistakable sound of 1,000 men moving through the dense foliage. They were coming, a wave of humanity with a single, brutal purpose. They were a force of nature, an unstoppable, unrelenting tide of steel and flesh. The men crouched in their foxholes, their hearts pounding in their chests, their fingers on the triggers of their weapons. The jungle, their eternal enemy, was now their ally, their final line of defense. It was a cruel irony, a final desperate twist of fate. The first Japanese soldiers appeared like ghosts, their faces painted, their bayonets gleaming. They moved with a terrifying grace, silent and deadly. They had thought they had the element of surprise. They had thought they had the psychological advantage. But they were about to learn that they were facing a different kind of enemy. They were about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a weapon of pure, unadulterated force. A weapon designed for this moment, this place, this brutal, final confrontation. The turning point was at hand. The silence was over. The screams were about to begin. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and fury. The first Japanese soldiers, emerging from the dense foliage with a chilling war cry, were met not with the distant, controlled fire of rifles, but with the brutal, shocking roar of a dozen shotguns. It was a sound that was both deafening and utterly unexpected, a sound more visceral and savage than anything they had ever encountered. The Japanese, fanatical and fearless, were a wave of humanity, a tidal force of bayonets and resolve. But they were shattered in a single terrifying moment by a storm of lead. Frank Miller, his heart pounding in his chest, watched the devastating effect. He had never seen anything like it. The 12-gauge buckshot, a storm of 9 pellets per shell, tore through the enemy with a savage, indiscriminate force. A single pull of a trigger was enough to take out 3 or 4 men at close range, their bodies ripped apart by the sheer kinetic energy of the lead. The Japanese, who had fought a war of ritualized, almost ceremonial close-quarters combat, were faced with something far more primitive and brutal. They were not being killed, they were being obliterated. The battle devolved into a close-quarters melee, a brutal, desperate dance of death. The jungle, once their tormentor, was now their tomb. The Japanese soldiers, their initial charge of bravado now replaced by a look of shocked horror, stumbled and fell, their screams of battle turning into screams of agony. They had expected to face men with rifles, men who would need to aim and take their time. They were faced with men with scatterguns, men who simply had to point and shoot, delivering a payload of death with a single brutal pump of the action. Davis, his face a mask of grim determination, was in his element. He moved with a practiced, almost serene rhythm, pumping the action of his shotgun, the low metallic click a constant, terrifying refrain in the chaos of battle. His broad shoulders absorbed the recoil, his eyes calm and focused, never leaving the enemy. He was a force of nature, a one-man army in a world of his own making. The shotgun, once a strange, out-of-place weapon, was now the most powerful tool on the battlefield. Johnson, his youthful terror replaced by a raw, primal instinct for survival, fought with a desperate ferocity. He had seen the power of the shotgun, and he was filled with a new kind of courage, born not of bravado, but of a desperate need to survive. He reloaded his Garand, his hands moving with a frantic speed, and fired into the mass of humanity that was the enemy. He no longer saw them as men. He saw them as a threat, a wave of death that had to be stopped. The Japanese, for all their fanaticism and courage, were not prepared for this. Their banzai charge, a tactic that had terrified and broken lines in other battles, was met with a wall of lead that simply tore them to pieces. Their brave, suicidal rush was turned into a futile, tragic spectacle of men being mown down with a speed and ferocity they could not comprehend. They fell like dominoes, their bodies a testament to the brutal, shocking power of the shotgun. Frank, a man of quiet determination, was now a man of action. He fired his rifle, his mind a blur of motion, his body moving on pure instinct. He saw Rodriguez, his rifle a blur of motion, picking off men with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He saw Davis, a relentless machine of death, his shotgun a constant, thunderous roar in the madness. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, a fever dream of violence and death. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the sounds of battle a constant, deafening roar. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last of the Japanese fell, their bodies a grim monument to a futile charge. The silence returned. not the coiled, expectant silence of before, but the dead, hollow silence of a battlefield after the storm has passed. The men stood in the ruins of their foxholes, their bodies shaking, their minds reeling. They had survived, but they had paid a price. They had stared into the face of death, and they had answered it with a brutal, unrelenting force. The jungle was no longer an enemy. It was a witness to their terrifying victory, and a quiet, solemn tomb for the dead. The silence was the most profound sound of all. It was not the expectant, heart-pounding quiet of the waiting, but the hollow, complete stillness of the aftermath. The jungle, which had been a witness to such a brutal, frantic chaos just minutes before, seemed to hold its breath, its leaves motionless, its creatures hushed. Sergeant Frank Miller, his rifle still warm in his hands, stood in the wreckage of his position, his mind reeling from the surreal, nightmarish ballet of violence he had just endured. His senses, still on high alert, registered every detail with a new, brutal clarity: the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder, the coppery scent of blood, the grotesque, shattered bodies of the enemy scattered amongst the foliage. The men of his platoon, once a group of tired, scared kids, were now something else entirely. Their faces, streaked with mud and sweat, were etched with a solemn, profound weariness. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, their bodies heavy with the weight of what they had just done. Private Johnson, the boy from Kansas, sat with his back against the side of his foxhole, his eyes staring into nothing, his hands shaking. Corporal Rodriguez, the quiet man from New Mexico, was on his knees, his head bowed, whispering a prayer in a language no one else understood. And Private Davis, the shotgunner, sat on a rock, his weapon resting on his lap, a strange, haunted look in his eyes. Frank walked over to him, the sound of his boots on the sodden earth an intrusion into the sacred silence. He looked at the shotgun, the tool that had been the instrument of their salvation. It was a beautiful, terrible thing. You saved our lives. Davis, Frank said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. Davis looked up, and for the first time, Frank saw the true burden that the man carried. He was not a hero. He was a survivor. His confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound grief. "It ain't a hero's gun, Sergeant," he said, his voice as quiet as the air around them. "It's a butcher's gun. They didn't stand a chance." His words hung in the air, a raw, brutal truth. The Japanese had come at them with courage and conviction, and they had been met with a force that was not a product of courage, but of pure, unadulterated, unceremonious violence. The shotgun was not a tool of heroism. It was a tool of slaughter. It had saved them, but it had also stained them. The victory was theirs, but the cost was more than just the blood of the enemy. It was the loss of a certain kind of innocence. Later that day, as the sun began to climb higher in the sky, a patrol of medics and relief troops arrived. They looked at the carnage with a grim, horrified fascination. They had heard the legends of the shotgun in the Pacific, a weapon so effective it was rumored to have been singled out for protest by the enemy. To see it in action, to see the sheer, brutal effectiveness of it, was to see the true face of war. It was not a grand, glorious spectacle. It was a horrifying, intimate, and deeply personal act of survival. Frank looked at his men. They were no longer boys. They were men who had seen the abyss and had walked back from it. They had done what they had to do. They had fought with a desperation born of survival, and they had won. But there was no glory in it, no parades, no speeches. There was only the quiet, haunted knowledge of what they were capable of, and a deep, abiding respect for the tool that had saved them. The story of the shotgun on Bougainville would be whispered down the line, a legend of a savage, brutal victory. But for the men who had lived it, it was not a story of heroism. It was a story of a day when they had faced a monstrous foe in a monstrous place, and had answered their fanaticism with a cold, brutal, and utterly final kind of violence. It was a story of sacrifice, of a life saved at the cost of a piece of their soul. And as they walked away from the silent, solemn battlefield, leaving the dead to the jungle, they carried with them the heavy weight of that knowledge, a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives.